From 2010 to 14, she was the deputy director of the institute. Before joining the Graduate Institute in 2009, she was professor at Florida International University in Miami, where she also co-directed the Miami, Florida European Union Center of Excellence. I think I got it correctly. Thank you. And next to me, and I won't mention anymore, the direction, Christina Finch currently serves as the head of the Gender and Security Division at DCAF, Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. Christina is a human rights lawyer and advocate with 20 years of experience in advancing human rights in the areas of women's and LGBT rights, hate crimes, and discrimination. She worked for the OSCE and served as legal counsel to the Human Rights Campaign and the Congresses of both the United States and the Republic of Palau. I hope I got that as well correct. Thank you very much. So I'm looking forward to an exciting debate. As usual, again, some housekeeping announcements for our open debate. Dear guests, following us online, but also here in Stans, the modus vivendi of today's debate is indeed participation. And therefore, especially also for our online audience, please use the chat option for getting in touch with us. An online facilitator will support me throughout the whole debate. And we will have a live stream, therefore, also between Urs, you, and me. The session is open, secondly, ladies and gentlemen, to the public, and it is an on-the-record event. And last but not least, Matthias Leutwiler, he looks quite concentrated. He's my graphic assistant today. He will draw a graphic protocol, and I hope to have him included as well into our conversation and bringing some perhaps also new and fresh and creative ideas. I'm not sure, can you already see his artwork? I think you haven't started yet because what I'm saying is not very important for you, or for the discussion at least. Yes, and here it starts. And I guess we start now with the open debate. And I would like to invite the panelists to come back to the question of our panel or of our discussion. The question was actually, gender expertise and mainstreaming in peace operations, good or harm, question mark. Would you briefly comment on this very question? Give your input, perhaps also your institutional position on this very question mark. Christina, would you like to start? 3-4 minutes.
Absolutely. Well, dear Excellencies, dear colleagues, a warm thank you, first of all, to our myriad hosts today for this event, including Swissint, SIA, and the Swiss National Science Foundation. DCAF has worked for over 15 years on the participation of women and the integration of a gender perspective in the provision, management, and oversight of security and justice. There's one project I'd like to talk about today in particular that is yielding some very interesting insights into this question. We know peace building and the need for women's meaningful participation doesn't start or end at the negotiation table or in peacekeeping operations. We know that women play many instrumental roles in promoting sustainable peace, and their meaningful participation in security institutions and peacekeeping efforts is critically important. So the project I want to talk about today is the ELSI initiative for women's meaningful participation in peace operations. It's a Canadian-led initiative, and DCAF's been working with Cornell University to, first of all, conduct a baseline study. The baseline study around women's meaningful participation in peace operations yielded 10 issue areas, which too often serve as barriers for women in peace operations. The issues ranged from several of the topics that I've actually heard talked about today. Household constraints. How can we make sure that women have the flexibility to take part in peace operations, and more broadly, in the militaries? What about gender roles?
What about social exclusion? Do they feel like they can actually meaningfully participate? What is the climate in the institution in which they are serving? And these range of issues led us to develop a methodology. We call it the MOWIT methodology, Measuring Opportunities for Women in Peacekeeping. And right now we're working with about a half a dozen countries, courageous countries who've opened themselves up to say, we want to look at what's happening in our institutions and what barriers women are facing. What are the issues that they're facing so that they can meaningfully participate? The countries range from Ghana and Uruguay, and these two reports we've just recently put online, to Norway. And they've yielded some really groundbreaking, I think, and insightful points that are relevant for the conversation we're having here today. So there's two insights I'd like to share in this debate. First, there's emerging evidence that security personnel, and this includes both women and men, who support gender equality, challenge stereotypical gender roles, and display inclusive forms of masculinity, are less prone to commit sexual exploitation and abuse, escalate violence against civilians, engage in corrupt practices, and they're more likely to denounce colleagues when they commit this kind of behavior. So what we see is inclusion leads to more peace-promoting institutions. Insight number two. The benefit of increasing women's meaningful participation in peace operation relates to shifts in the institutional culture, much of which entails changes in men's behavior towards, for example, prioritizing community engagement over displays of strength. And that's something that we talked about in workshop number 1 or 2, the one I was in just a little bit earlier. Hope you were too.
2.
Thank you. And shifting institutional culture is not as simple as increasing the number of women. And this brings me back to achieving the goals laid out in the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Achieving them while meeting operational effectiveness imperatives requires a paradigm shift. Instead of interventions determined to achieve parity goals by helping women fit into inadequate work environments, the international community, and that includes national institutions, needs to move towards addressing the structural conditions that allow for meaningful participation. We need to find new, better ways to truly anchor gender equality in security sector institutions at the national level, which will not only ensure that more women join their ranks, but it'll also enable them to better fulfill their mandate. So bringing it back to the question, gender expertise and mainstreaming in peace operations, very good, but let's do it in a transformational way that really makes a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Puli?
Well, the question, thank you very much. The question is gender expertise or mainstreaming in peace operations, good or harm? I can think of few occasions where expertise would be bad. And I think in this area particularly, it's sorely needed. We heard this afternoon many examples of how, in different ways, gender affects conflict dynamics. And there's a great need to understand for the military how that works and how they can integrate that into their work. We heard some things like integrating locals into decision-making, local people, having women part of decision-making, thinking of security as large, which has heard wonderful two insights. The resolution 1325 has the merit of having transformed, at least in our heads, women from a sole role of being a victim, a potential victim, to an actor. And that's a great merit of this. And ignoring that comes obviously to a cost. Women need to be part of the solution. Now coming to the armed forces, they might be traditionally structured, hierarchic, very focused, for some maybe one-dimensional, focused on their mission. But I do think that in the last years, ever since this resolution saw daylight, and especially in recent years, there's a great consciousness in the armed forces of the meaning of this, how it has to be implemented in their work in the field. And this is my last point. When we want to see a difference of how gender topics can influence conflict prevention, peace building, etc., we need to be able to translate all these good theoretical concepts into tangible measures on the ground. We need to have relevant practices for the armed forces. We need this translation to be conducted. As a policy shaper in the executive branch, I am intensely interested in measures that can be implemented than just theoretical concepts and academic debate. So I very much commend any effort that this conversation this afternoon can help us go in that direction exactly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lisa, you are writing or would like to take over?
I can take over. Good or harm? To begin with, the answer seems so obvious, right? Of course it's good. But is it? Good or harm for whom, I guess, is the question. Good or harm for the mission? Good or harm for the society in which the mission takes place? Good or harm for gender relations, gender equality? And so associated, I think, with that question is actually the question also of gender expertise and gender mainstreaming. To what end? And if the end is the effectiveness of the mission, if the end is to have effects, like Vanessa said earlier, intelligence gathering, engagement, preventing sexual violence, nothing wrong with that. But that's not what 1325 set out to do. That was not the intention of the activists that lobbied the Security Council to create something like 1325. For creating inclusive polities, inclusive societies, participation, democracy, well, that's more broadly, I would think, something that from that perspective might have also been something that was envisioned, as long as that vision of democratic society and inclusive policy includes also gender equality. Does that end perhaps also require, I'm using a very theoretical concept here now, transforming the patriarchal war system? Violence prevention? Is gender expertise and gender mainstreaming of peace operations, that's the question, is that going to lead us there? Not that sure. So I guess the question that's related, and I'm going to be critical here now, is also whose expertise? Are we going to listen to the expertise of the women on the ground that do peace building every day? Or are we going to get trapped in our institutional perspectives? Our, whoever that is, but our is always somewhere further north than in the south and somewhere higher up in the hierarchy than those at the bottom. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a good thing, but it could be actually quite pernicious.
So you would add another question mark?
Question mark.
Thank you.
Well, gender expertise is going good or harm. I think Professor, what's her name again? Bruegel. She has asked the right questions, good or harm. As a politician, I would say, of course, it's both, and it depends on the person. Well, I think most women in here would say, of course, it's good. I don't know about the men. Maybe they would say, well, I don't know, because I mean, I'm not a scientist and I'm not a researcher, but I think there are enough empirical studies who really prove that women, that gender and peace building, that it offers a lot of opportunities. That's much better than if there is only if there is none. But sometimes nowadays I feel that people are overrun by all the challenges. Men, they have to bring in so much in a way. They have to deal with the women then. Now we've been talking about sexual harassment already. Of course, it's a big deal. It's a big problem. But I think for women, when we can participate, we should participate. But still, there is this lack of participation on our side. And before, I was saying that for me, there are so many questions in terms of this conversation we had before. There is this lack of participation of women in general. I often don't know why there is this lack of participation, why it's still there, because we have so many opportunities, we have so many possibilities. On the other hand, we want a lot, and I think that's fair, but now we're talking also about gender, and on the one hand, I think it's wonderful to have just women on this panel, but we also have to be careful that if we discuss gender problems or gender questions only with women, that it's not just a problem that women face. I mean, gender is a question that concerns women and men, and sometimes I think it would be better to have a man on a panel, or two, or yes, like 50-50 on a panel, and not just women discussing this. The same we had with people before. I mean, all the experts, all the expertise was given by women. I mean, it was all perfect, but I think the real value you mostly get when you have both sexes included in the discussion, when you have experts on both sides. And I think we only have equality once we don't have to discuss all this anymore. I'm really looking forward to the day, I think it's gonna last till, I hope not a century, but probably decades, when we don't discuss all these questions anymore, when it's just natural that there are both men and women in teams in peace building, so that the whole thing is really sustainable, and you bring in all different qualities to its best.
Thank you very much. And I guess before starting now the conversation, I guess, I mean, we could just right now start, but then we would, Senator, leave out the audience, and there are a lot of male participants as well here. I think we need to include them as well. And before getting started now with the discussion, and since we were emphasizing on participation, since we were emphasizing inclusion, I would like to propose a method getting your voices as well heard. And it's perhaps a small challenge, but I guess we accept the challenge. The method goes, has the so-called title 1, 2, 4, all method. I'm not sure if you have heard of. The idea is right now, you have 1 minute, each of you, not the panelists, you have already spoken, 1 minute silent self-reflection on the question of today's debate. 1 minute. And Urs, you are going to take the time. 1 minute from now, think about this very question, perhaps also regarding the opening statements from our panelists. 1 minute from now, obviously also it goes to our audience following us online. 1 minute from now. ideas or debate the questions or the hypothesis you came up with in pairs, building on ideas from your self-reflection. Please meet, as far as COVID allows us, meet in pair and discuss your ideas with your pair. And you have another 2 minutes. You can have a coffee because you are getting afterwards challenged. So. Soll ich das 4 ja noch machen? Okay, time is over. Stimulating discussions. Unfortunately, I need to interrupt you. And due to time constraints, I would like to leave part 4, grouping in 4, because you need to leave quite soon, so therefore to take most of the time. I'm not sure, these 2 men are very, very, do you want to take over? Present your question, or present your hypothesis you were discussing with your colleague, Brigadier General?
Yes, sir.
Just 1 second, you need the micro.
Just discussing what was said before, and we agree absolutely that there are both sides, positive as negative. You have to figure out which way helps us to get better as a peace builder or a nation builder in a broader sense, and there are both sides. So we agree absolutely with Ständerätin Gmür and also with you. I wouldn't focus just only on a 100% ideological view. I would look at it a little bit broader and figure out appropriate solution in case you are engaged. That's a short briefing.
Thank you. Supporting some panelist statements, thank you very much. And perhaps Daria, your statement.
So we discussed kind of the perspective you're talking about, if it does harm or good, and we think, well, we said if you use gender as a tool or gender also as a worldview to really understand relationships, and without really taking a stance here, but we think it's really harmful if it's essentializing women and reinforcing stereotypes. So harmful in that way, but it can also do good, depending on the perspective you take, I guess.
Another supporting voice for your position, right, if I have got you correctly. And perhaps I'm looking, Thomas.
Practical approach, because when you asked us the question, there was one picture in my mind, this LMT in Mališevo, like the liaison monitoring team. It used to be only male. It was a male team because...
Could you please repeat, because we can't hear you.
Sorry. It was actually only a male team because we assumed at that time it was a very conservative area. So we sent only male members of this LMT. And in the end, we had no contact at all with women, with children, with hospitals, with any kind of maybe female institutions. And at one point we changed that and we started to have women in these teams and to have also the female interpreters, which we didn't have like earlier before. And now the team is much more effective. We have a different like contact to all the people in this area, in this region of the Kosovo. So I think it is really, really a good thing to do. Maybe he will add something more different than I say, but to me personally, and also from a practical point of view, this is a really good thing to do, because otherwise we would just miss on half of the population, more or less.
Thank you very much. Anything to add, Thomas? And we mean Swissint, right? You are representing Swissint.
The gender point goes, in my point of view, in the wrong direction. We are looking just men, women, but it's much more. We should include culture, politics, sport, economy, and this is what we do in our missions in EUFOR and Swisscoi. 2 weeks ago I was in Bosnia and we were quoted as the best gender team in the field, and this was in Trebinje and Mostar. But there were just 3 women out of 9. But we were from different cultural backgrounds in Switzerland, from teacher till lawyer, from a Swiss champion in sport, from 22 till 62 years old. I think this is also important. We are on the right way, but we need time to be gender equal.
Perhaps, excuse me, we take this very position you both brought up, because the previous 2 positions were quite supportive in that, and I think we come back to that very position. But I think, Christina, this goes to you, right? Because you are really in between academia and policy.
I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think to give a tiny bit of academia,
you know, when we talk about gender mainstreaming, right? The classic definition is taking the different needs of women and men and girls and boys into account. When would we ever not want to do that? When would that make whatever we're doing more effective, right? I mean, the data is very clear on that, and you only have to listen actually to our colleagues in the Swiss military talk about their operational experience to know that having not only, you know, taking into account women's needs, men's needs, girls, boys, but also intersectionally, and I'm really, really happy to hear you raise that issue, but intersectionally, and this is a point Dr. Prugel made earlier, people aren't just one thing, and even looking solely at their gender, you really need to look intersectionally at race, religion, age, all of the other factors when you're really trying to make sure that you're not only gender mainstreaming, but trying to take the needs of an entire population into account, be that when you're on a peace operation or when you're looking internally within your own institution about how you can make that a more equal and human rights compliant institution. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Perhaps giving it over to you, Andrea Kmür, since, I mean, you have, or representing the political field, how would you approach that, that very issue that we need to look more, into details and not having just like this black, white or male, female perspective, how you could translate that into politics, or how would you translate that into politics?
That's a good question. I would like you to help me answer it. I think in terms of law, we are always talking about all the details, but I think it was Christina Finch before who said that, or somebody in the audience, that the whole process, I mean, we have laws, that's what we are doing all day long, but the way we live them afterwards, that's the other question, and usually all these processes, they need time. My question would be, how can we accelerate the whole process? The gentleman from Swiss Aid, I think he brought in the question about diversity, and there, I mean, I completely agree with you. We need completely mixed teams in terms of people's background, religions, ethnicities, etc., so that we can really, not only in peace building, but everywhere, get the best results. And somebody was also talking about ideology there. I mean, I completely agree as well. It doesn't bring us as any further. But really, my question is, how can we accelerate these processes? I mean, it usually doesn't take 1 year, it takes ages. And I realize myself that I'm often caught in stereotypes. I mean, when I was like 20, I was always 100% standing behind the military, but I would never ever have had the idea to go to the army myself. Now, or Monday, I went with my youngest son to Emmen because he had to go to the military service, and there were quite a lot of young ladies. On the one hand, I was delighted. On the other hand, I was a little bit amused as well, because for me, still, it's strange. I think, I mean, it's great that also our federal counselor, that she wants to have more women in the army, and I think we can only benefit from it, everybody, but still I have to get used, to get accustomed to that thought as well. And as I said, I think it needs time, but we have to move on with more speed.
But it is prima vista a societal issue, right? And not a political issue per se.
Well, society and politics very often, I mean, it interferes. There's this link, and I mean, we had the law where you have Aktienrecht. Well, what is the law? The revision where we had not the women a quota for women, but that you have to have in every board of administration within the next 10 years, 5 years in the Board of Administration, at least 30% of women. If you don't succeed, then you have to explain why you were not a successful compliant, or explain, is that called? But I mean, that's a societal issue which we put into the law because we didn't succeed within decades. So we haven't succeeded within decades. So when you don't make any progress, when you haven't made any progress for ages, then we try to put it into a law. But there, at the beginning, there was a lot of opposition already in terms of this very simple change. But now I think it's accepted. And so, as I said, it usually takes time, but we should try to accelerate the whole process.
But nevertheless, we have Mexico, we have Canada, we have France, having already implemented, and please correct me, a feminist foreign policy agenda. Mm-hmm. Perhaps, Ambassador, what would you say as a policy shaper to that very point? Is it really necessary to have a feminist foreign policy agenda?
Well, I don't think we operate with these concepts in the government, feminist policies or anti-feminist policies. I think we have a set of goals, and just to come back to the points that were made by the audience, I do think that the goals set out in the resolution 1325 are purely positive. The question is, do they have a real impact in people's lives? Does it make a difference compared to what we were set out to do, or the United Nations with this resolution? Perhaps the success is not as great as it should be, probably not. The other question is it really counterproductive? I doubt it. Somebody said it could even reinforce stereotypes. When you have a debate, when you have new measures, when you want to implement a policy, you will always have also the downsides. But I think we should concentrate on the positive impact these changes can bring about. And when you talk about feminist policies in the government, somebody said at the podium, are we not trapped in the institutional perspective? My answer to that is, unless we set out to reform institutions and make different policies and take decisions that are implemented, then we will remain, excuse me for saying this, but then we will remain in the academic discussion. And I think what we really need to do here is the academia can provide very meaningful insights and things that we don't understand in the government. We not even have the tools to observe or to realize what's going on there. But we need to have this input, and then eventually it needs to be put out and articulated in policies and decisions. Otherwise, it will not change anything.
No one respond?
Wow. I'm not opposed to changing institutions. I've spent half of my life working on gender mainstreaming and trying to describe what happens when that happens. I also would like to second Ms. Knue's observation that there's a relationship between society and policy. I mean, obviously, it has to be, right? Because after all, that's why you do policy. What I would like to caution against is that we get trapped in the idea that if we change institutions, all goods will follow. I agree, Ambassador, with your assessment that 1325 opened up an enormous amount of space for all kinds of discussions. Some of these discussions have been very fruitful and have created massive, important change. Some of those discussions, frankly, make me very, very nervous, in particular when it ends up replicating certain stereotypes about women do this, men do this, and we think we do gender mainstreaming because now we make the women do the things that they were supposed to do. So, and all of that happens because you can't control a policy ultimately, right? You have a policy out there, you unleash it, in particular if it comes from the UN and goes down. It just floats around and it does things. And then it becomes dangerous. It becomes dangerous because now we have drowned out the voices of those on the ground who are often affected. And so yes, gender mainstreaming is incredibly important, but it can't be the only thing, and it needs to work with activists and civil society organizations. Otherwise, it's just a dangerous tool, honestly, is what I've come to believe.
Thank you. And I think we have the chat as well running. Hi.
From the YouTube stream, and it's more a remark, maybe it influences now the podium. Even gender is a question that goes even beyond the single axis understanding male, female, women, men, that we didn't talk until yet.
I mean,
the question was there earlier. How do you overcome the dualism? You queer it, right?
Queer it.
I mean, it's so obvious. And then, of course, you intersect it, right? So both needs to happen. And we talked about constructions of masculinity earlier. I mean, are we open to embracing different masculinities in the military? Is that possible, right? And what does that then mean for gender relations more broadly?
Anybody else?
Very briefly, how to overcome the dualism men-women. I personally would wonder if I want to identify myself with this question. I don't think we need to overcome this because at the end of the day, we remain very different in the way we function, and I think that's okay. The point I was trying to make this afternoon in my opening remarks was that never mind us being different and being perhaps more prone to protectiveness or being more emotional. Even that should be okay in my eyes. There's no, I mean, I don't want women in the armed forces or in the security field to try and emulate masculinity. That would be denying what you are. My point is much more that being women what they are, they can perform equally well, if not better in some cases, than men in the traditional vocational occupations by men. And just one last point, as some of you may know, that I was born and raised in Finland. I emigrated to Switzerland a couple of decades ago by now, but the gender equality has sort of disappeared somehow from the discussion because we probably have the feeling we live it. And one example, just one anecdotal example, is that Finns don't have a word for she or he. And we certainly don't have a word for actress and actor. We don't have these, the linguistics doesn't allow for these differences. And that is perhaps symptomatic how we go about genders. It has disappeared from the discussion actually. And I think this is a societal change that is taking place in many countries in Europe. And for some strange reason in Nordic countries it's more advanced. But I think Switzerland's on a good way in that regard.
And just like a follow-up question, I'm looking to our military personnel. I guess in the Nordic states, they don't really make a difference between men and women, even regarding sleeping quarters. I think they even share sleeping quarters. Do you know some?
Swedes, I think.
The Swedes?
Yes.
This is not yet reality here in Switzerland, right?
I'm not a specialist in that field, and I don't had my proper experiences in that. But I heard talking about it. But I have also to say, once the Swiss armed forces go out of the barracks, we don't make any differences at all. So if we take a bivouac, as we say it, so we mix male and female as well.
Okay, we start with bivouacs.
They want to be treated equally. This is a point of pride for men, women, especially I think the armed forces, and this is great.
There's a question over there.
So my time in the military is a little bit long ago, but I'm still on duty, and the equally thing in the military is, I think at the moment is really good, but at my time it was like the bivouac wasn't that easy because they told me, yeah, you have to go 500 meters away because you're a girl. And then they forgot me in the morning. And I think I think the step from the army was like really big in the last few years, but I think there are many, many more steps to go. And I think that's a generation question, and it just takes time that it can grow. So I hope it's growing.
So again, a societal question, right? If I'm correct. And I would be wondering what you guys were discussing, the both of you. Yes. I can't hear you. Just repeat it.
I say we talk all the time. Maybe other people should talk.
Okay.
we just said that we agree that it is positive, but it should not become a checklist problematic. Because we noticed that in some missions, that was your point actually, if something happens, the organizations go after checklists to say we're not the problem. We trained everyone correctly, and everything's gone right. But it doesn't help it doesn't change anything in the problematic, and that's the big dangers of the institution. And that this is why institutional change probably is needed, at least on that point. That was our discussion.
Thank you. So I would just caution also that we are very careful about not sort of homogenizing men as this and women as this. Again, going back to the intersectional approach, And what Christina's remark in terms of that their research has found that, right, it's about security personnel who support gender equality. So you can obviously have women in spaces that do not support gender equality. We know this. We can have women in spaces that support militarism and patriarchy and all things that we might potentially, right? And the impulses behind 1325 certainly did not support. So to me, I think one of the main dangers is that you hit a 15% quota and you say we have equality, right? That's a problem. Also, what do we actually mean by equality? Do we mean that women are treated like men, right? Can we also imagine what equality might look like if people are respected for their differences, and that means internally within the group classified as women and within the group classified as men? So, I mean, for me, what's dangerous about this conversation is that we're not actually talking about, you know, the underlying structures that need to be transformed. So if you just add women into spaces and don't actually work to transform the cultures of those spaces, you might get, I mean, we have plenty of women in the US military, and that is a deeply violent and you know, high rates of sexual abuse against both men and women. So I think we have to be very careful when we're talking about you know, the presence of bodies in spaces as if that in and of itself is enough to create change.
A lot of nodding. Let's somebody take over, Lisa, perhaps? I think you will agree on that point.
Yeah, Liz, thanks. I just agree 100%.
Well, she's reiterated our research back to us, so I can only also agree, but absolutely, and I think this also goes back to the point that our colleague watching on the YouTube video made. It's about masculinity, like healthy masculinities, it's about inclusivity, it's about intersectionality, and absolutely the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex community is a part of that. And so looking at how we can actually transform the institutions and talk about healthy masculinities, healthy gender roles is actually a really, really critical point that came out that has been coming out quite clearly in the research that we've been doing, which we then wish to operationalize, going back to Ms. Muir's point about the role of parliaments and oversight bodies into then translating that into action, the role of institutions then actually implementing effective policies that go beyond just gender mainstreaming training that targets the women, right? But that doesn't actually transform the institution. So everything from, you know, making sure that facilities are adequate for everyone who's using them, to making sure that there is top-down leadership around these issues, to making sure that there's effective oversight, yes, by parliaments and ombuds office, but also by civil society, which we've been talking about a lot today, which play an absolutely critical role in holding governments and institutions to account and helping them live up to these ideals. Thanks.
Yes, I completely agree with the last statement. I think all of us, it's not just about numbers and quotas, and I was also said in the discussion this afternoon, it's not about just how many women we put in the armed forces and the PSO, it's more than that, of course. I think the point is that we cannot tolerate discrimination and not granting equal chances. I think this is the point, and to be able to detect that, we need to hone our senses, especially in institutions like the military, that you become conscious what might constitute discrimination and not equal treatment. But this will not take place naturally. I don't think there's a cosmic law that eventually leads us, all societies, to become to produce gender equality. It has to be facilitated and accelerated, I hope, by policies and by changing attitudes, which begins from in the very small age of children and beyond that. So I think that we have a role and responsibility as state actors and civil society especially, of course, to pull a society in that direction that we deem right and equal.
Thank you.
I also think it's very important that in education at the very early age you start I mean, to raise children, boys and girls, in the same way. But I think very often, even there, we fall into stereotypes. And I think, after all, there are differences between men and women, and we don't have to get rid of them. But I think change has taken place also in Parliament. I mean, for example, we have now, for mothers, a separate room where they can breastfeed their babies. That wouldn't have been possible, I would say, 20 years ago. And I remember my father, who was also a senator in the Canon of St. Gall at the time. I was then around 20 years old, and for him it was just an impossible idea that a woman could become federal councillor. And I mean, there already I thought, well, why shouldn't that be possible? And I guess he was not the only one who was thinking like that 40, 50 years ago. And so at least there have some changes taken place. But as I said before, it all takes time. But if at least there is this sensibility there. I mean, the remark there before online with the kind of gender, of course, I don't know whether this person was thinking about gender in terms of the whole LGBT scene. I mean, we talk about LGBT people much more nowadays, and there are firms making big ads in the newspaper that they don't discriminate anybody, that everybody is welcome. And on the one hand, I think it's a good idea. On the other hand, I think, I mean, this is ridiculous. Why don't you just take anybody in your firm who really is competent for what you want this person? And it doesn't make any difference whether this is, or it shouldn't make any difference whether it's a man, whether it's a woman, whether it's a homosexual, a transgender person, whatever, just competence, the personality, and nothing else. And there as well, I think we still have to make quite a few steps.
Lisa, you want to take on that?
I fully agree. I mean, that's precisely the way to go about it. Yeah, and the question that I think remains, I mean, this is a very long vision. This is very long down the line. Even Finland, right? I mean, and the idea of, you know, do we get to know somebody and do we not immediately think, oh, this is a man or a woman, right? I mean, it is something that influences how we look at the world, or, you know, the famous thing of the child is born, is it a boy or a girl? It's the first thing that everybody asks, because if we don't know whether it's a boy or girl, we actually get really, really insecure. We don't know how to behave, right? Because it's so ingrained that that being human is associated with a particular gender. And so, you know, even though in the abstract I'm totally agreeing with you, I also think that this is, it needs policy. I agree. It needs policy because it's not going to happen automatically.
Thank you. I remember you were saying we need transformational ideas, transformational power, and I also remember you saying we need measurement. We need scale, perhaps also up to a certain level, to get this idea perhaps also implemented. Could we perhaps talk a little bit more about this transformational, or could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more about this transformational idea, and then perhaps also how we can translate that very phenomenon into, I mean, more political-oriented, output-oriented schemes, perhaps?
So the point I was thinking about transformational change is one that we've heard, I think, a lot from everyone today around. It's not just a numbers game. It's not just about adding more women in. We know that an increase of women in a particular armed service doesn't actually translate to that same amount of increase in women being deployed to peace operations, for example, to go back to the ELSI initiative. So there's something else happening there. So when I was talking about the baseline study that we've conducted that came up with the 10 issue areas, they all put together, they lead to transformational change.
That's what's needed. But when you break them down, there are meaningful, concrete steps that policymakers, that leaders, that people can take to make change, right? So when you're looking, and we've heard some of them actually today, so when you're looking at things like household constraints, right, you're looking at, can a woman deploy? How long can she deploy for? Because women disproportionately have caregiving responsibilities. We also discovered in our research that quite often they're then subject to rumors about the woman who's been deployed for so long. So how about infidelity, sexual behavior? So how do we actually then make sure that women have the flexibility to deploy and that they are supported in their role? So you're talking about a whole of family support, social support structures for that deployment. Looking at things like deployment selection. So are you actually meeting the needs of the peacekeeping operation? What are you actually recruiting for? So the discussion that we've had throughout the day is about how the new issues that deployed personnel are looking for are high-value assets that have very specific skills that need to be deployed. So are you actually looking for people that have these skills? Are you training women to make sure they have the skills available? And also, are they even aware that they can have training, that these opportunities exist? So that was actually something that I had heard today in our discussions, is there's a concern that women aren't even aware that there are opportunities that exist, how they can take advantage of them, what their entry points are. I've mentioned things like top-down leadership, really critical. I've mentioned oversight, both by civil society, but also parliaments. Then a range of policies around sexual harassment and accountability, and then are those policies actually being implemented? And the final point I would make is, again, around gender roles and social exclusion. So are we actually, in the sense of making that transformational change, really undertaking policies that are going to lead to women's meaningful participation, and then enacting those policies and actually walking the talk to make sure that they are implemented and that women can participate. So I think there's a range of actual concrete measures that can be taken to help ensure women's meaningful participation.
You want to reply or
I
add?
don't have much to add. Thank you very much. This is the core issue: how to translate ideas into policy and introduce realism and concrete measures. Of course, this is what policy is all about, in contrast to politics, that then debates these measures and maybe changes them, introduces their own measures. But we in the policy sector, we tried always to think, how can we move things, change things with even minor little measures? And I gave some examples this afternoon. Those on the armed forces, how to concretely identify the barriers that are responsible for these very low numbers of women in the armed forces. And we are far yet from understanding why exactly is it like this and why is it so different in Nordic countries. What I do know is that you cannot transport, you cannot transplant a cultural setting from one country to the next. In Norway, there's a competition for men and women to be able to be selected to the armed forces. They only take those they really need, and there's a huge incentive set for Norwegians to serve in the military. And it's a competition, really. But we couldn't possibly transport this to Switzerland and think it's going to work. But by the way, it would not be compatible with the militia system. If I may, just very, very shortly come back to what we discussed before about the gender. My perception is not in the Nordic countries that it's denying the agendas and their specificities. It just has become such a topic that there's no need to express that in language. There's no need to emphasize the difference because it's plain there for everyone to see. And it's sort of kind of normality, and there's no need to put that into policy. It's a clumsy way of putting that, but this is difference. It's not denying the differences at all, but it's just accepting them without making much fuss about it. That's how I would like to be tempted to put it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can we have Matthias drawing? How was it for you? I mean, you are not an expert in this field. You're an artist. How have you been capturing this?
Well, there's a lot of information from a lot of different people. And it felt a bit not very linear in a way. I mean, it was a bit like a patchwork of different views, but there was some, I guess, like a red thread. What I see is that everybody agrees on it's not just positive or negative. Then there's this whole idea or this talk about participation, and that it's not just by, you can't just do this with policy, or that there's a danger in this whole quota equals equality thing. Yeah, and transformation. I don't need to repeat what I heard.
I think the summary needs. I think you need the summary, because Brigadier General Rudin and his team is writing a diversity report, and perhaps you could, or your colleague could, make a kind of a synthesis of today's day, and not leaving it to the panel. What you're going to take out of that very discussion of the day, and what you're going to include into your report. Thank you, Brigadier General, for your closing statements.
You're my real friend. Now, to make a summary from my point of view, being responsible for the long-term development of the armed forces and the military administration, doing a diversity perspective, actually for our Minister of Defense, I take a lot with me. We have proposals to figure out solutions, to have a better understanding, a cultural change, an inclusion, a diversity inclusion to establish in our Department of Defense. And I got a lot of insights today, and I take with me many ideas. I can underline perhaps and tell you what we did a few years ago, or two years ago. We made a proposal for equality, that every young Swiss girl has the same chance to get informed about what she could do on her way, becoming part of the armed forces. So she would have a chance. So we tried to get a mandatory orientation day as well for women, and politics said, no, we don't like to. So we have ideas, we go straight forward, small steps, step by step, and I'm looking forward that we will really change the culture in the armed forces, I'm sure. And the other question is a cultural change in our society takes us, it was mentioned, a long time. That's what I take with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this male conclusion. And therefore, I guess we end here, because I know you need to rush and...
You can discuss without me.
No, but I think we leave it here. It's just already 5 minutes over. I thank you very much for the panelists and the audience, and as well the online participants, for being part of this exercise as well. Thank you, Matthias, and also thank you, the film crew, and obviously to my team, Urs and Nives, and a special thanks goes to you, Commander, for being the host for today's event. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, and I mean, there is an aperitif served. We need a transfer. Mirko, The transfer is just out there, I think, ready for transfer. It is a restaurant just nearby the railway station, or in between the railway station and the garrison here. In that sense, I guess we close here the session. I wish you good evening and safe return to your home bases. Thank you very much.